Chapter 5. The path was narrow and uneven, and the climb was steep, but the Scandians, in spite of their bulk, were in excellent physical condition, and they maintained a brisk pace under their leader. There were few grunts of exertion from time to time, and the occasional stone would be dislodged from underfoot and go rattling down the hillside. But on a whole, the 30 raiders made little noise as they jogged up the path toward Al-Shabaab. Everything was a compromise, Erak thought, just as he'd taken a lesser of the two risks by approaching along the bay's coastline rather than from further out at sea, where the ship stood a better chance of being spotted. Now he had to balance speed against stealth. The longer they took to reach their objective, the greater the chance became that their presence would be discovered. That would make the fight a lot harder. By the same token, if they rushed up the path at full speed, they'd also create the chance of being heard. So the best way was to steer a middle course, maintaining a steady jog. The sealskin boots thudded softly on the sand and stone underfoot. It was more noise than he would have liked, but he estimated it would remain unheard even if there were listeners at the top of the cliff. There was a bad moment when one of the men immediately behind Erak lost his footing and tottered, arms waving desperately at the edge of the steep slope leading down to the sea. Fortunately, his axe was in the carrying loop at the top of his belt. Otherwise, his arm waving might have separated some of his friends from their heads. He let out an involuntary cry, and his shuffling feet released a volley of stones and rocks that clattered down the hillside. In an instant, he was about to follow them, and an iron grip caught hold of his collar of his sheepskin vest, and he felt himself heaved back onto the firm ground by the overyawl. "Gods above! Thanks, Chief," he began, but a huge hand clamped over his mouth, cutting off further words. Erak thrust his face close to the man and shook him, none too gently. "Shut up, Axel," he whispered fiercely. "If you want to break your neck, I'll do it quietly. I'll break it for you." "Sorry, Chief, he muttered, but Erak shook him again. "Shut up," he hissed. Then, releasing his grip on the other man's collar, he glanced anxiously toward the top of the cliff, waiting to see if there was any sign that the rowers' clattering and yelling had been heard. The entire raiding party waited in silence for several minutes. Then, as there was no sound of the alarm being raised above them, there was a general release of tension. Erak pointed upward and led the way again, jogging steadily up the steep slope. A few meters from the crest, he signaled for the men to halt. Then, gesturing to Svengal to accompany him, he covered the remaining distance to the top in a crouch, cautiously peering over the crest as he reached it. Svengal, a meter or so behind him, mirrored his actions, and the two big Scandians knelt side by side, taking stock of the situation. Al-Shabaab stood 40 meters away, across a bare patch of ground. The town was surrounded by a low stucco wall, a little over 2 meters high. Even if there were sentries patrolling, it would present no real obstacle for the Scandians. They were skilled at scaling walls like these. 2 men would stand at the base of the wall, holding a length of an old oar handle between them, at waist height. Then, the rest of the group would take a running start, one at a time, and each man would step up onto the oar. The 2 men would hold it and heave upward, sending their shipmate soaring up the wall. It took practice to get the timing right, but it was one of those skills all Scandian practiced from boyhood. Today, there would be no need of it. An arched gateway stood 4 meters to their right. The gate was open and the entrance unguarded. "Too easy," grinned Svengal. His captain frowned. "That's what I was thinking," he said. "Where are the guards? Where are the lookouts?" Svengal shrugged. In spite of the absence of any guards, both men were still keeping their voices low, speaking barely above a whisper. "We've caught 'em with the back door open, Chief," he said. "The guards, if there are any, are probably around the front of the town, facing the ocean. That's where they'd expect an attack to come from." Erak rubbed his chin suspiciously. "Maybe," he said. "Wait here, while I take a closer look." Rising into a half crouch, he moved across the open space toward the wall. At every second, he expected to hear a challenge, a shout, or an alarm bell ringing, but Al-Shabaab was silent. Reaching the wall, he edged his way along to the open gate. With one fluid movement, he flicked the massive battle axe clear of his belt loop and hefted it in his right hand. Then, moving with deceptive speed for someone so bulky, he sprang through the open gateway, quickly facing right, then left, axe ready, shield up to protect his left side. Nothing. The flat-roofed white houses stretched away from him down the narrow street. A few windows were black squares in the whitewashed stucco. The doors were firmly closed. Nothing moved. Nobody stirred. Al-Shabaab seemed deserted. Erak hesitated a few seconds. It seemed wrong. There should be a guard, even one man patrolling the wall. Then he shrugged. Maybe Svengal was right and the Aridi guards were concentrated at the seaward side of the town. Perhaps all the lookouts were straining their eyes for the first sight of a ship approaching. Or maybe they'd just grown complacent. It had been over 20 years since a Scandian ship had raided here. The secrecy surrounding the timing of the treasure caravans had kept the coastal towns safe. It was only the fortuitous acquisition of the timetable that had led Erak to plan this raid. He shook his head. Maybe he was getting too skittish. Maybe the time he'd spent lolling around Hall's home was making him behave like a nervous maiden aunt. Abruptly, he made up his mind, moved back to the gateway, and signaled Svengal and the others to join him. The soft thud of sealskin boots across the sandy ground awoke no response from the town. Svengal glanced inquiringly at his leader. "Where to now, Chief?" Erak gestured with his axe. "Town center. We'll follow this street. It seems to be heading in the right direction. Keep your axes ready and your eyes peeled." He led the way again, and the raiding party followed in two files, peering around them at the silent houses. From time to time, at least two men in the line would do a sweep, turning through a full circle to make sure the enemy troops weren't coming up behind them, and studying the flat roofs of the houses that stood on either side of the path for sign of enemies. But there was nothing to be seen. The street wound its way toward the town center, eventually opening out into a small square, where a large building faced them, taking up one side of the entire square. This would be the town headman's office quarters, Erak guessed. He searched his memory for the name of the building. The Cadif, he remembered? The equivalent to a town hall or tax house in other towns. Half a dozen narrow streets opened on the small square. The buildings had formed at the other three sides, probably shops, eating houses, and inns, were colonnaded with deep verandas that would give welcome shade from the heat of the sun during the middle of the day. As he had thought, Erak glanced at the east, where the sky was already glittering with the streaks of pink. The front of the Cadif, facing the square, was also colonnaded. The building itself was the only two-storied structure in sight. Like the others, however, it had a flat roof hidden by a decorative facade designed to give an added feeling of dominance to the building behind it. In the center of the square stood a small fountain. Its reservoir was currently full of water, but the mechanism that allowed the water to flow from its central spot appeared to be turned off. Erak stepped out into the square, his men following. As they exited from the narrow street, they formed into a compact diamond formation with the Oberjarl, Svengal, and Axel at the lead point of the diamond. A few of them swung their axes experimentally as they crossed the square toward the two-story building. Still, there was no sound of alarm. The growing light cast their shadows in elongated, fascinated forms behind them. Erak stepped up to the marble porchway before the catif's big double doors. He studied them briefly. Solid, he thought. Hard wood with brass hinges, and a good strong lock. Still, Scandians carried their own 2 keys for doors like these, and he motioned for his brawnier rowers to step forward. Axes, he said, gesturing toward the door. The men grinned at him. One of them set his axe down and, for a moment, spat on his hands, then seized his axe in a 2-hand grip. Erak stepped away to give the men room for a good roundhouse swing at the door. "Stop right there!" The command rang out across the square, and the Scandians turned in surprise. A figure had appeared from one of the side streets leading into the open space. A few of the raiders cursed in alarm. Eric's eyes narrowed, and he felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. It had been all too easy, he thought. The newcomer was tall and slim, dressed in an ornate fashion of a Riddy warrior. Flowing white shirt and trousers, doublets of fine linen, were covered by metal-studded leather body armor. A long, curved sword hung at his side, and a circular shield made of metal, presumably brass, was on his arm. The shield, Erak noted, was equipped with a small central spike. It was a weapon of attack as well as defense. A simple acorn-style helmet, also piked, surmounted a small roll of fine cloth wrapped around the man's head. Probably, Erak thought, it was designed to avoid contact of the sun-heated metal on the skin during the middle of the day. The helmet was highly burnished, and a shining silver curtain of chainmail hung from it, protecting the wearer's neck at his sides and back. That, and the highly polished metal on the armor, were enough to show that he was a senior officer. As they watched, a double file of warriors equipped in similar, if not as expensive, fashion quickly jogged out of a side street, fanning out to either side of their leader. Erak estimated there were at least 40 of them. There was a surge of movement from his own men as the Aridi warriors appeared. "Keep it steady," he glowered at them, out of the corner of his mouth, and said to Svengal, "We're outnumbered." "Not by too many," Svengal replied. He too had been counting the opposition. "I think our boys can take these fancy Nancies without too much trouble." Unlike Erak, he hadn't bothered to keep his voice low, and it carried across the square to the Aridi officer. They saw his narrow-bearded features split by a smile as he heard Svengal's comment. He raised his silver whistle and blew once. There was a grinding sound and the heavy timbers dragging on stone, and the Scandians saw each of the half-dozen streets that led out of the square suddenly blocked by heavy timber barriers pushed out from the walls. "Didn't notice them," Erak said quietly to Svengal. They must have passed by one of the barriers as they entered the square, but he'd been too busy to realize its significance. "You appear to be trapped," the Aridi said. Erak set himself a little more firmly and brought his shield up to a defensive position. His men mirrored the action. "So do you," he replied. Again, the other man smiled. The white teeth were very obvious in his dark, bearded face. "Ah," he said, "but how many archers do you have with you?" He raised the small silver whistle to his lips and blew one long, shrill blast. There was a shuffle of movement overhead as Erak watched. The rooftops to the 3 sides of the square facing them were suddenly alive with archers. He had no doubt there were more on top of the catif's flat roof as well. Even without counting, he could see that there was close to 100 men, all armed with short, recurve bows, each of them with an arrow nocked and drawn, aimed at the defiant Scandians. Erak glanced grimly along the line of bowmen. The bows were short-range weapons. On a battlefield, he might have ignored them, but here, in the confined space of the town square, they would be deadly. "Don't anybody move," he said quietly. "One false move, now could mean a volley of arrows sent in their direction. Axel, beside him, growled in frustration. His fighting blood was up, and he didn't like the threat of 100 arrows aimed at him. His instinct was to strike out and damage somebody. "They can't kill us all, Chief," he said. "At least we can do for Pretty Boy here." The tall Aridi smiled at the words, his hand dropping casually to the hilt of the curved saber he wore. Erak knew a fighting man when he saw one, and in spite of the highly polished accoutrements, he had a feeling that this was one dangerous warrior. "Shut up, Axel," he said. Not for the first time that morning. The Aridi took a pace forward. He raised his eyes to the men on the rooftops and made a hand signal. The archers released the tension on their bows, although, Erak noticed, they kept the arrows nocked and ready. "There is no need for a fight," he said. His voice was deep and pleasant. The tone was reasonable and unthreatening. "There's only one of you we're interested in. Hand him over, and the rest of you can go free." "And who might that one be?" Erak asked, although he felt he already knew the answer to the question. "Erak. The one they call Oberjarl," the Aridi answered him. Impulsively, Axel took a pace forward, raising his axe threateningly. "You'll have to go through the rest of us to take him," he shouted, defiantly. Erak heaved a deep sigh and shook his head in irritation. "Well done, Axel. You've just told them that I'm here."